Okay, so good evening, everybody. Sorry for that delay. Okay, it wasn't too many minutes. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about uh, one of what I consider one of the most fascinating personalities in the times of the Rishonim, uh, Rav Moshe Mikutzi, who had a major impact on history, halacha, the Masorah, uh, all sorts of other things that he had a tremendous involvement in. And today he's hardly known. That's one of the funny things, even though he had a very significant place in halachic history, particularly among Ashkenazim. Now, I'm going to, and he has significance as a mochia or as a person who was makar rechokim. Uh, he has a significance as a halachic authority. He has a significance as one who brought together the Masorah of Ashkenaz and Sfard together. He has a significance as an early Ashkenazi major halachic posek, and uh, he has also very other significance as the counter of the Taryag mitzvahs, in which he has a huge role as a innovator. So I'm going to, at the same time, we know very little about him personally, and most of what we know about him is what he wrote himself, and he didn't write about himself. That's why we know so little about him. Okay, so the background with him, and I'm going to start out with the question that I raised in the emails as the title. Bring you know, as number one. I'm going to bring in that part of the discussion first, the very beginning of this conversation. And then why did I pick this parsha to discuss him? And that's because some of his most interesting uh, observations that I can talk about are his innovations halachically show up in yesterday's parsha was Chanan and today and this coming week's parsha Eikev. So the week between was Chanan and Eikev is like the most significant week I think to talk about him. So let me first give us a sense of background on here. Who was Rav Moshe Mikutzi, and why am I talking about him? And what does this have to do with a Jewish count of Cousy? So for those familiar with it, there is a Marcus Lehman book called The Count of Cousy. It was written in German. Marcus Lehman or Mayor Lehman was a very well respected Rav in Germany of about the same time as Rav Shamshon Frohirsch, the 19th century. I believe he was 15 to 20 years younger. I didn't check his biography. But he felt in what he needed to do for his at the time that was not being done was literature for young people to read that would give them a Torah hashkafa. So he wrote novels, historical novels, which had all of them had a background in giving a feel of what Jewish history and a pride in what it is to be a Jew, with huge amounts of hashkafa embedded within the text. Something that we're very familiar with today. It's very common, but you're talking about almost 200 years ago, and maybe 170 years ago is probably more accurate. 100, right? And he put out now most of these. When I was a kid, this was the Jewish literature we had to read. And obviously, I didn't read it in German. I read it in English. It's available today. I know it's most of his stuff has been translated. Most of his novels have been translated into Hebrew and English. I would be surprised if they haven't been translated by now into language like French and Spanish. Also, potentially Russian. I don't know. I don't know what they've been done with them. But anyway, so Family Aguilar, Captive Princess, Count of Cousy, all sorts of other things that he wrote about various curious events over Jewish history, where the Torah person wins out to what he needs to do, etc. Now, in the Count of Cousy is pretty much a fiction, but he did base himself on the fact that there was a title called the Sar Kutsi, and the and he was not the first one to create a story about a person called a Count of Cousy, who was supposed to be one of the Bali Tosfos, who was at the same time a medieval count or medieval nobleman. Uh, Others before him had done so, but it's all based on a historical fiction. On the other hand, as we're going to see, the term Count of Cousy, both as a non-Jewish term and as a Jewish term, is perfectly halachically true. It's just that the story that he told is an imagination, but it's a great story. So it's a great story to read. But anyway, now there was a position called the Counts of Cousy or the Lords of Cousy. Okay, I believe that in the final word I misspelled it on the way it's usually spelled. It's usually spelled Coucy or Couci, and I believe I spelled it with an S in the middle there. But okay, we'll pardon my ignorance of medieval French. There are numerous villages. I would say they call them hamlets. Okay, in France today, whose name is Cousy. There is a famous tourist site. You can call it a tourist trap if we want to, but tourist site called the Chateau de Cousy. Okay, which is there, but that in northeastern France, far northeastern France. In other words, from Paris, these places are, let's say, a 2 hour drive, 2 to 3 hour drive, depending on the road quality and where you're going. There are several different villages in that area. So must have been there was at one point, that area was called Cousy, or there was whatever it was. There were various places called Cousy. Which one of those was where Rav Moshe Mikutzi or Rav Shimshon Mikutzi and the others that we're going to refer to tonight came from? We have no idea. I don't think anybody knows anymore where they came from. Now there is a castle still available. I believe they give tours of it, and that's in one part of the general area called Cousy. There's also a village called simply Cousy. There's 2 or 3 other villages called Cousy something, and each of these are literally hamlets. I don't think any one of them has more than a population of a couple of hundred. Some of them have populations in the 2 digits. So these are hamlets scattered through northeastern France. I would say, like, if you want to go by highway from Paris to Calais, okay, from which you can take a ferry to England or to Dunkirk for that matter, if you'd really rather go to visit Dunkirk. Okay, well, you can also get a ferry to England. If you go on the highway there and you go, at one point you'd have to turn off the highway in the east-northeast direction. Okay, you'll bump into one of these things. You'd have to probably plan your trip, otherwise you'll never find it. But if you try to find them, you will find that there are 3 different places I found on the map. There could be others that are of Cousy, and one of them has a population of as much as I think about 800. All the others are smaller, so don't expect to find any Jewish presence or any old shul in any of these areas if you go to visit them. These are farming hamlets, okay, that still exist, one of which has a castle, and that's why it's a tourist site. That's why it has the greatest population in today's world. These were a hereditary lordship, okay, that started sometime way back in the time of the Middle Ages. It was under there were archbishops who controlled it at times, and there were counts who controlled it at times, and there were various and others. And we do know, as a matter of fact, here I have in front of me a list of known lords of Cousy. None of these are Jewish, okay? And it's a very interesting list. It has about a dozen of them. I would say about half of them died in battles or in the Crusades. So I guess that was probably the what a lord did in those days. You went to war and you got killed. But there's I would say at least 12 to 15 of them listed here, and half of them have things like died during the Second Crusade, killed during the Third Crusade, died in the battle of whatever this battle is. I don't know what it is. So that's the background. In the around 1400, okay, the lordship of Cousy was purchased by Duke of Orleans, who I believe later became one of the kings of France. So the history of the counts of Cousy ended around 1400. It began as early as we have at least somebody in the 11th century. So it was at least around close to 400 years that there was a position called the Count of Cousy, but it had nothing to do with anything Jewish. Now, there was a Baltosvis named Reb Shimshon of Cousy. Now, Reb Shimshon of Cousy becomes Rosh Mikutsi. As popular, when you have Reb Shin, it was very common that they inverted the letters. They made it Sar Mikutsi. It was simply a colloquial way of talking. For example, Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. Okay, the Israeli way of referring to him is Sar Hirsch. If you ask somebody who they will refer to him as Hassar Hirsch. They don't usually refer to him as Rosham Shufo Hirsch. They'll refer to him as Hassar Hirsch. And that has nothing to do with his being. Nobody claims that Rabbi Hirsch was ever a count or a duke, right? It was simply Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Shimshon Raphael they make into Sar Hirsch, okay? And that's how they call him, Sar Hirsch. I've heard Israelis who probably haven't done much to study him. They just know about him and they just referred to him as in that period of time there were some very great gedolim in Europe. There was the Sol Salanter, whose obviously his family name was not Salanter. Salanter was the town he came from. His name was Lipkin. And the Maldim, whose original family name was not Maldim either. Okay, he had a family name, but Maldim was based on an acronym of his name, and Sar Hirsch. So they'll refer to. They were all, by the way, just about born in just about the same time. They were all three born and passed away within a few years of one another. So all three of those great Gedolim. But so the term, that's where the term Sar Mikutsi came from. In other words, technically speaking, right, there never was, right, a Jewish Count of Cousy as we know it. However, that doesn't make the term Count of Cousy not accurate. First of all, there was a Count of Cousy. There were many of them. There were hundreds of them probably in the 400 years that there was a non-Jewish lordship there. Number one. Number two, the smog about whom we're going to talk, and I'm going to refer to as the smog, we'll see why in a second, okay, was definitely a count of Cousy. And I'll show you why in a second. Okay, very shortly we'll get to why he was a count of Cousy. So now what person I want to talk about, right, is Reb Moshe of Cousy. Reb Moshe of Cousy had a brother-in-law whose name was Reb Shimshon of Cousy, who he quotes many times. Reb Shimshon of Cousy and Rosh Cousy were both of the Baalei Tosfos school. In other words, the school started by Rashi's son-in-law and grandsons, great-grandsons in northern France. Cousy, as we mentioned before, was a section of northeastern France. It's to this day that area, or towns or villages in that part. It's, if you wanted it today, imagine it's, let's say, 2 to 2.5 hours drive northeast of Paris. You can go by Paris to Calais on the coast in about 3 hours. But this is like off the road towards the eastern, a little bit to the east from the road from Paris to Calais. And it's taking you off the country road. So it's going to take you a longer period of time to get there. Don't figure on doing the trip in 3 hours. Figure on doing the trip if you're going to be in Paris and you want to go visit Cousy. Figure the trip's going to take you a little longer, either by rent a car or by train or by bus to take it. So I'm just giving you background now. Who was Reb Moshe Mikutsi and why is he so significant? Okay, so and then the question, of course, is why is he so forgotten? Okay, now, Reb Moshe Mikutsi, okay, was one of the Baalei Tosfos. Okay, we don't know very much specific biographical information about him, except for the fact that we do know that he was a itinerant preacher, as we would call it, who traveled through France and Spain in the 13th century. Now, he tells us about his travels a bit. He tells us the dates of his travels, and he tells us a bit about some of the things he taught and his accomplishments on these trips. So he writes us the date, and I'll just give you the dates in English. In 1235, the 13th century. Okay, now remember, in 1235, the railroads in France were not running at top efficiency. Okay, nor were the buses, right? And the fax machines didn't. So he had to travel either by horseback or by a wagon. Okay. And he went apparently from the very northern part of France all the way down to the Provence, speaking and going to places as he did so, different places, speaking where, and in different communities. He probably, this is my assumption based on the geography of the area and my knowledge about the Rishonim Zira, he probably traveled by ship from the French coast of the Mediterranean towards either Barcelona or somewhere else on the Spanish coast, and then made a trip through Spain, coming, and he doesn't tell us anywhere about the town. He just tells us that he went to, I presume, dozens, if not hundreds of communities, right? And I'm just going to share with you, he mentions here, I'll come to it again. He mentions that he was influential in getting tens of thousands of people to wear tefillin. Now, I don't know anybody in history who has been influential to get tens of thousands of people to wear tefillin. And he tells you why, how he did it, what he did, and he gives you even a glimpse at why these were people who were basically halachically committed people but weren't wearing tefillin at all. And he intimates about this a bit. He doesn't say, we have to read between the lines to figure out what it was that he got them to change their lifestyles, that they started to wear tefillin. He also was instrumental in Jews who were intermarried to non-Jewish women and getting them to break up their marriages and to return to Judaism. Now, remember the story of Ezra. He definitely followed Ezra's approach and not what people would do today. Ezra's approach was, he went into saying, people told him, a lot of people here are married to non-Jewish women, right? Well, today the approach would probably be, well, try to get those women and kids to be converted. That's what I think most people would do today. And Ezra didn't do that at all. Ezra's approach was, tell them how upset you are. Let them see, don't tell them, let them see how upset you are and see if it makes a difference. And in Ezra's day, hundreds of them sent away their wives at that point when they saw how upset Ezra was about it. Okay? And apparently, Moshe Mikutzi, the Smag, was just as successful. Now, here's the background on the story. I'm going to read the pieces inside soon, but here's the background. In 1235, okay, he set out on his trip. He writes that it was divinely inspired. He doesn't tell you how. Something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that he should travel. He saw this as the hand of Hashem. He very often, describes things that Hashem, communicated to him, and he says a lot of it was through dreams. And there is more than one place where he refers to the fact that in a dream he was told to do something, and then he went, or a dream he was told that he had misunderstood a halacha, and then he went and restudied it and realized he was correct. Now, I have to tell you that I frequently remember my dreams, and my dreams never have me doing anything like that, right? My dreams are all very curious. Well, not usually scary, just curious, about what I'm dreaming about. But I have yet to have a case that I can recall where I had a dream, and then afterwards I said, oh, that dream told me that I should relearn the sugya, like the Beis Yosef describes, relearn that sugya, and you'll realize that you made a mistake in pshat. But the Smag has such dreams, and he tells you that. So in 1235, he set out on his trip. Okay, just to get a sense that we know where that is. Okay, the Rambam was gone already at this time, as was Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Tam's nephew. The Ramban was just about being born. Okay, the Radak was a young man. Okay, and the Smag. So in other words, the Smag is in that period of time in which he's after Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, the early Bali Tosfos. He's way before, the later generations of Bali Tosfos and the Maram and the Rosh. Those are after him, and as a matter of fact, many of those were Talmidim or Talmidim of his. Okay, so he's in that period of time there, in between, between that. He's earlier than the Ramban and the Radak, the Radak was in Provence, Okay. And he's after the Ravid who was in Provence. He's before, let's say, people like the Mir. He's before the Ramban. Okay. So he was traveling through France and Spain. Must have been like a good year or two travels. It was not exactly just a question of checking the train schedule, looking where the next train city is, and seeing if there's a community to stop and speak at. Right. This was a trip that I do not know if when he was set out, he had any idea which communities he was going to visit on the way. He probably just knew that there were large Jewish communities in Spain, and he went there and he just went on his way until he found, as he was going through it, he found various and different communities and places to visit. I would assume that that's more or less, what how he traveled his thing. He did not come back the same way he left. He tells you that, which must have meant he crossed the Pyrenees on the way back. And he went like through Spain up to the northern part of Spain, crossed over the Pyrenees, and then traveled up France on the western side of France on his way back. In other words, probably went down the eastern side of France on his way there in the western side. But I really don't know because he doesn't tell you anything about it travel. And as a matter of fact, he tells us very little about what he did in France. He tells us mostly about his speaking engagements in Spain. Now, I'm assuming that that was probably because Spain probably had a far larger Jewish community at the time than France did. He also doesn't say anywhere what language he spoke to them in. Did he speak to them in Ivrit? What language did they speak at the time? The French Jews spoke French. But they also presumably spoke Hebrew. So what did the Spanish Jews? They spoke Arabic, Spanish, Hebrew. I don't know. The writings that they write, the literature that they write, is all in Arabic. So I'm assuming that the Spanish Jews at the time were speaking Arabic. He does not evidence anywhere that he knew Arabic. He probably spoke to people in Hebrew, I would imagine. I'm just conjecturing, but he never mentions this. It doesn't seem to have been that language was a conflict. It doesn't seem to have been a problem at all. That language was a problem. Okay, so this is his background. At 1240, after having returned to Cousy after his major trip, he writes there that while he was traveling, they asked him to write a book on the Taryag mitzvahs according to halacha. And they said that, and he discusses this, he says, well, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which was apparently well accepted and known about in Spain at the time, as far as I can tell, he might have been the first one to bring the Mishnah Torah back to northern France, to the Bali Tosfos. I have no evidence of anyone earlier than his time who knew about the Mishnah Torah's existence, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah's existence. And it wasn't that long after the Rambam, two generations, a generation. This time, 1235 is about a generation after the Rambam passed on. The Rambam's writings were well known in his own time in the southern part of France, Provence, which was really a separate country at the time for all intents and purposes. Actually, there were no countries as we know it this time. It was a medieval system. There were local dukes and counts and this and that. And then sometimes the king had a little more power than the other people underneath him. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he had more authority. Sometimes he had less authority. The Provence did not consider themselves French. As a matter of fact, historically, I would say most Talmidei Chacham will consider the Talmidei Chacham of Provence Sephardim. That's not accurate. They were not Sephardim. They did not read Arabic, but they were exposed to the culture of the Arabic culture by being close to the Mediterranean, close to Spain. But they also had exposure to the schools of the Bali Tosfos who were in northern France in this period. So the Spag went on his travels. He becomes intimately familiar with the Rambam's writings, particularly two of the Rambam's writings, that is the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvahs and the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. He quotes from the Mishnah Torah extensively in it. Now, we'll wait and tell you what it is. While he was traveling, people asked him if he could write up for them a work that would include not a full detailed discussion of all of the Torah Shebaal Peh, but the primary parts of it, the most important parts of the Torah Shebaal Peh. And he writes that he decided he was going to do that. Okay? And when he got back to Cousy, he then devoted his life to doing so. his time to doing so. And he came out with one. It took him a couple of years. And there are places in this Smog book where he tells you little backgrounds about it. Now, here's where we get to his feature as being a mitzvah counter and as a halachic authority. Okay, and he had both roles in this book. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah decided to organize things in his own halachic fashion. He tells you that's, we see how he did it. Okay. He had entertained doing it in other styles before, as we see from his own writings, that he had decided he was going to write the Mishnah Torah, but he had not yet decided on the style he was going to follow. Okay. And the Rambam wrote the Sefer HaMitzvahs as an introduction to the halachic work that he had not yet written yet and was just planning on organizing, because he wanted that to present. He said, before he does this, explain to people how you count the Taryag mitzvahs. Up until this time, almost everybody followed the system of the Baal Halachas Gedolos, which goes back to the time of the Gaonim, and his approach to counting the 613 mitzvahs. The Rambam felt that the Baal Halachas Gedolos method of counting the 613 mitzvahs was a vast error. And he had a completely different system of counting the 613 mitzvahs. And his 14 rules, which 14 shroshim that he presents as the first half of his Sefer Mitzvahs. So the first half of that, and the second half, right, is where he gives you the listing of the 613 mitzvahs and why he counts them as mitzvahs. That's what he's doing in the Sefer Mitzvahs. That's his purpose of it. The first half is rules to establish how you know what to count as a mitzvah, and basically why the Baal Halachas Gedolos' method was all wrong. Okay, now, prior to the Rambam, all the counts of the Taryag mitzvahs based themselves on the Baal Halachas Gedolos' style, at least his forest. If they didn't agree with all his trees, they followed his forest. Okay, so they may have disagreed with him here and there, counting this mitzvah, that mitzvah, but their basic approach that he used, they all used. And that includes people as early as Rasad Yagon and as late as the Sefer Yereim, who, although historically was after the Rambam, I don't believe ever saw a copy of the Mishnah Torah or the Sefer Mitzvahs. The Sefer Yereim was a Talmud of Rabbeinu Tam. He models his halachic work, the Sefer Yereim, on the mitzvah counts, and it follows the Baal Halachas Gedolos' approach to counting the mitzvahs. So you have the Sefer Yereim, who was not much before the Smog, okay? Not much at all before the Smog. And he's still following the Baal Halachas Gedolos system because he never saw the Rambam system, not the Sefer HaMitzvahs, and not the Mishnah Torah. The Ramosha of Cousy was fully familiar with the Rambam's writings, I would assume because he traveled through the Provence where the Rambam's writings were very well known, and then through Spain, where they were again well known. And by now he knew the Sefer HaMitzvahs, he knew the Mishnah Torah. And he then went and he started counting the 613 mitzvahs, but followed the Rambam's forest, the Rambam's general approach to how to count them, but not following all the Rambam's trees, as we'll see. And he even criticizes the Rambam in places for methods the Rambam used in counting Taryag mitzvahs, but they're not counts as a general rule of is disputing the Rambam's basic 14 rules. They're more in details. So the Smog created his own count of 613 mitzvahs, which follows fairly closely the Rambam's approach. There are enough places where he disagrees that it's certainly not the Rambam's approach, okay? But he does follow it, okay? In more or less, that's his general approach, is to follow, right, the Rambam's approach, okay? And in so doing, he goes through a very lengthy description here of the halachos. He goes through a halachic discussion that even in the mitzvahs that are not germane bisman hazeh, he goes through a basic description of what the halachas are. He doesn't go to all the nth detail, right? But those that are practical, but in today's world, he does go in nth detail. And those that are not as practical as well, he goes into enough to have most of the discussion. Now, the Smog's work, okay, he called it simply Sefer HaMitzvahs. He did not call it Sefer HaMitzvahs Gadol. We'll see in a second why that name got attached to it everywhere afterwards. Okay. The Smag's work became accepted as the primary halachic work in Ashkenaz, at least until the time that the Rush was available, and probably well after that point. Numerous Perushim were written on the Smag well after the Rush was well available by a host of poskim. Everybody from the Rav Isaac Stein, who's the early one, Marshal wrote a Perush on it, the Chumas Hadeshin wrote a Perush on it. Numerous others wrote Perushim on the Smag. As a matter of fact, even the Mizrahi wrote an extensive, it was a Sephardi in Turkey, wrote an extensive Perush on the Smag. So the Smag became, right, the halachic work, and that's why if you look at the margins of your Gemara, you have a set there called the Torah Or, and it gives you references in every Sugyas Hashas to Maimoni, where you'll find this halacha mentioned in the Rambam. Smag, that's who we're talking about, and where it's mentioned in the Smag, and Tur v'Shulchan Aruch. What we all know about Rambam, we all know about Tur and Shulchan Aruch, and the Smag is placed in the same category. That's where the Torah Or, because in the Torah Or's day, who was a posek in Italy in the 1500s, okay, the Smag was still heavily used by the Jewish communities of Germany and Italy as their final major halachic authority for Minhagei and Posek Ashkenaz. Now, the Smag was the earliest, way before the Rush, the earliest to incorporate both what the Rif and Rambam had written and what the Rashi and the Balitosos had written. And in every one of the mitzvahs, when he goes to understanding the sugya, he'll mention to you what Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchak said. Who is Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchak? You know who Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchak is. You just know him as by a different name. You know him as Rashi. Yeah. He calls him Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchak. And he refers to him as Rabbeinu Yaakov. Rabbeinu Yaakov, in one place, he refers to him as Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Meir. We know him as Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, and he refers to numerous Rabbeinu Rabbeinu Yitzchak ben Shlomo. No, Rabbeinu Yitzchak ben not Shlomo. Rabbeinu Yitzchak ben. Oh, I'll remember it. One a different. Anyway, that's the Ri, the Baltosus Ri. So he goes through numerous of them, and he has their mentions their they were like, his uncles, and so he mentions them the way you would mention them, right? As your uncle, so he has them and he mentions them throughout. Okay. Now, that's a bit background. After the Smag, okay, a disciple of his, and he may have still been alive when this happened, Rav Yitzchak of Korbei, okay, wrote a sefer called Amudei Olam, and that was written for lay people. And he wanted it to be a book that everybody would read, and he even advertised, he wrote it out, and he put in the introduction, every community should have a copy of this. Okay? If you're in a community and you get a copy of this and nobody has one in locally available, hire a local scribe, okay, have him write it out, and you can take from the public funds, and he tells you exactly how much to take from the public funds. I don't remember the exact figure. Take a certain amount of money, he says, take from the public funds, and that money from the public funds, you can go ahead and hire, even if nobody in the community has authorized it, I'm authorizing it, right? That you should go ahead and spend for the public funds, blank money, hire somebody to write a copy and send it on, okay? And in the sefer, okay, which he called Amudei Olam, it later on became called the Sefer HaMitzvahs HaKatan, and the sefer of the Smag was called Sefer HaMitzvahs HaGadol. But the Smag called the Sefer HaMitzvahs, and the Smag called the Sefer something else, Amudei Olam. And the Smag, at times, in his introduction, he tells people, this book is meant for everybody to go through once a week. You should go through this book once a week, and I'm dividing up into 7 sections, 1 section for every day of the week. And this is your goal for every week, what to do. And then after you're finished, okay, if you want to go into something in more depth, go get hold of of the smog, say from mitzvahs, and go through it in more depth. This is not meant to be in depth. This is meant to be right. The brief understanding of people should be doing. So this was the smog and the smoc's contribution to it. Now the smoc's work was meant for France. Okay, he didn't mean it for Spain. Right, the smog's work was meant for to go back to Spain. Did it get back to Spain? I haven't the slightest idea. I'm sure it must have at some point. When, I don't know. But that is a bit of background here on what the smog did. Now, I had promised that we were going to do a few pieces from Parshas Weschanan and Parshas Eikev. Okay, and I'm going to read a few sections here. I apologize as I read these sections. The volume, the issue of smog that I own is the size of a Shas Gemara. They're very big and very heavy. The contraption I have rigged up here that I can read from while I look like I'm looking directly at you, right, won't hold the weight of it. So I have to keep them on my table here, which means that while I'm looking at them, I'm looking like this. I'm not looking away from you or down on you at all. Chas v'shalom. It's just I don't think this will carry the weight. No, it's no way it's going to carry it of these svar. Maybe I could put it up here, and this might work. I'm going to hold it while I'm speaking, holding it and seeing if this will work. So it's a little bit better. It doesn't look like I'm looking down at you or just hunching over a little bit, which isn't so good. My chiropractor will tell me I shouldn't be doing that. Anyway, I'm going to bring the part. It's in his third mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of Avas Hashem. We all know about the mitzvah of loving Hashem. But in this piece, he has a fantastically interesting essay here that he goes into. After talking about mitzvah Avos Hashem, he tells you about, and some of the ideas he has here are original. I don't know anybody else who says these ideas, some of them. Some of them are just telling over Gemaras, and some of them are the history of his successes, which he doesn't overburden, but he wants you to know about them, to know that you should also do something about it. So here's how he talks about it. He says there are three mitzvahs that are aspects of the mitzvah of Avos Hashem that we call, in the Torah calls them os ve'edus. Okay, I will translate edus as testimony. I will say os as divine sign. Divine sign not of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, divine sign of us, on us, to us, of us. These are testimonies of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's divine signs of us. Now, you need for testimony in halacha 2 witnesses. These are 3. What are these 3? One of them is Shabbos and Yontif. One of them is Bris Milah. And the third one is Tefillin. Because that's why on Shabbos we don't wear Tefillin, because on Shabbos you have 2 witnesses to what you are. You have Bris Milah, you have Shabbos. Obviously, we are talking here to men, not to women in this context, but that's a different conversation for a different time, right? The women weren't guilty of not wearing tefillin. It was the men who were guilty of not wearing tefillin. So now he says, now, if you don't wear tefillin, so on Shabbos you've got 2 signs. On weekdays you have only 1 sign, and that's not enough. Okay, b'chol, everyone is obligated to wear tefillin, and apparently these people felt that they were not obligated to wear tefillin. He hints at 2 possible reasons why they may have thought that. One of them is seemingly, I mean, he says so pretty clearly, the Gemara says that in order to wear tefillin, you have to have a guf noki kalisha bal knafayim. There was a man about whom the miracles happened, so Gemara describes in great length in Shabbos that there were miracles happened to him in the times of the Romans when there was laws against wearing tefillin. Okay, I guess since I went this far, I might as well tell the rest of the story quickly. He wore his tefillin in the street, as he was accustomed to doing. The Romans had made a law you're not allowed to wear tefillin. Roman soldiers chased after him. Okay, he grabbed his tefillin off his head. He put them in his hands, and they asked him, "What do you got in your hands?" He said, "Pigeon wings." And they insisted he open his hands, and he opened his hands, and what did he have in his hands? Pigeon wings. And then the Gemara asks, well, why do you say pigeon wings? That's like a funny thing. And it says because pigeons protect themselves with their wings, and the wings are not strong enough to protect them. And Klal Yisrael protects itself with its mitzvahs, which the mitzvahs are not strong enough to protect us, but they will be strong enough to protect us, even with wings, even if they're only pigeon wings. And that's called the story of the where it says, why did the miracle happen to Elisha Baal? That's why he was called Elisha Baal Knafayim, because of this miracle. So Elisha Baal Knafayim kept what's called a gufnaki, which means he was very careful what he thought about. His body, he was also able to control in terms of flotation and other things that might be a concern while wearing tefillin. And apparently these people felt, well, if I'm not at the Madreg or Elisha Baal Knafayim, I'm not only not, I don't have to wear tefillin, I'm not supposed to wear tefillin, I'm not allowed to wear tefillin, so they didn't wear tefillin. That's not true. The Gemara means if you want to wear tefillin all day long. If you want to wear tefillin all day long, you can't. You have to be in the level of Elisha Baal Knafayim. But if you just want to put on your tefillin just during davening, like when everybody does today, you put on tefillin at the beginning of davening, you daven, you take them off afterwards, right? That he says you don't have to be like Elisha Baal Knafayim. You just have to be careful enough to take care of your thoughts and your controls during that period of time, which is easy to do. Anybody can do that, right? That's step one, he says. Okay, and he brings a proof, very interesting proof. He says, which has more kedusha, tefillin or a Sefer Torah? No, someone want to answer me? Which has greater kedusha?
Sefer Torah.
Okay, a Sefer Torah certainly has greater kedusha. Okay. He says it now. The same rules that apply about when you're wearing tefillin, that you have to have a guf naki and you have to have everything, apply when you're holding a Sefer Torah. So if you're taking a Sefer Torah out of the Aron Kodesh, or you're holding the Sefer Torah because Kriyas Torah has been finished and they're waiting to put the Sefer Torah back, you have to be careful about the same rules of guf naki, right, as someone wearing tefillin. I have to admit, I was unaware of this halacha until the Smag introduced me to it. Now, the Smag says, now, is there any rules that these people are not holding a Sefer Torah? They come to shul, they're in shul on Shabbos, they hold the Sefer Torah. The answer is that they know that they can keep a guf naki at that point, so they can also keep a guf naki for the length of time they need to wear tefillin when they daven in the morning, right? And if they have difficulty with that, just put on the tefillin for a few minutes, say Shema, and take them off afterwards. He doesn't say that, I'm saying that. But that's what he says here. He then points out a statement that I will just tell you what he says. I find this to be a fascinatingly interesting statement. He says, who is it more important that they should wear tefillin? A tzaddik or a rasha? I mean, I would have said both. They both should wear tefillin. I mean, what are you picking, a tzaddik or a rasha? Who should wear tefillin more importantly? Smag says, no, it's more important for a rasha to wear tefillin. A tzaddik has other mitzvahs that will remind him of Hashem. A rasha doesn't. So it's more important for a rasha to wear tefillin. And we now know why Chabad has the idea of making sure people wear tefillin, even if they're not keeping any other mitzvahs. Right here, lying this in the Smag here, he's definitely saying it. And then he goes off into a whole discussion about what we know as, when we say Kaddish, he doesn't go into details here. How long do you say Kaddish for? Well,
11 months.
11 months for a parent, right? And 12 months if you're saying Kaddish not as a parent, for somebody else. Why? Well, the reason is because it says that Posha Yisrael Bagufan, somebody who did not do tshuva for their Averis, will be in Gehenna for up to 12 months before they go to Gan Eden. Well, he says, what is a example of Poshe Yisrael Begufan, someone who sinned right with his body? So he says, the Gemara says somebody, Karkafta de Monach Tefillin, a head that never wore tefillin, that didn't wear tefillin. Correct, the words are that didn't wear tefillin. What does that mean, a head that didn't wear tefillin? He quotes two opinions in early Rishonim, Rav Alphus, the Rif, and the Rabbeinu Tam. One of whom says somebody who decided he is not wearing tefillin. He is not because he doesn't have tefillin, not because he can't keep a guf naki. He is adamant, opposed to the idea he is not going to wear tefillin. the Rif says it means someone who never wore tefillin in his life. Okay, those are the two opinions that he quotes. Okay, he says now. Okay, an Adam Rasha, meaning he didn't do other mitzvahs, but he wears tefillin. He's no longer a karkaftalo anach tefillin. Right? He's no longer a head who never wore tefillin anymore. So it's definitely more important for him. An interesting statement and a different position on it. And he goes through this whole thing of it, and then he says at the end of this whole discussion, okay, I'm just telling you a few tidbits of this discussion. This is right in his Sefer HaMitzvahs. It's Mitzvah Say Gimel. You can go online. You can look at Bar Ilan or Hebrew books or any of the other book that works there. You can look at Sefer HaMitzvahs Agodol, Mitzvah Say Gimel, and at the very end, very, very end, he tells us it was, and he tells us what the Hebrew date, which is corresponds to your 1235. Okay. There was a reason from Shemayim that I had to go out preaching. It doesn't say what it was. Siba min hashamayim l'hochiach. In the year 1236, I was in Spain, okay, to give them tochacha, to give them admonition, okay, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu strengthened my hand with the dreams of the Jews and the dreams of the non-Jews and the signs of the stars. I have no idea what he's referring to here. Okay. He continues, okay, I was well received. The ground trembled. I'm assuming what that means was that there was an earthquake at the time. I don't know what else he would mean, right? So he was there. There must have been an earthquake. We can go find out in history if there's any record of there being an earthquake somewhere in Spain in 1235, but it's a pretty big country and there's enough mountains there. Wouldn't shock me that there was an earthquake somewhere in Spain in the 13th century in 1235 or 1236. Okay. I accomplished because of this conversation, this tochacha that he gave, etc., etc., etc. Okay. They did major tshuva. Tens of thousands of people. That's what he writes here. Tens of thousands of people. Alofim u'revavos began accepting to put on tefillin, mezuzah, and tzitzis. Now here he just told you about tefillin. He doesn't tell you what the background on mezuzah was, or why people weren't putting mezuzahs on their doors, or why they were not wearing tzitzis. Right, but he says those three mitzvahs he specifically mentions here, obviously because they all tie into the concept of Avas Hashem, and the Rambam puts those mitzvahs in his Sefer Ahava. Okay, in other words, the mitzvahs of Avas Hashem and the Rambam include these three mitzvahs. He's clearly, without mentioning anything about the Rambam here in this part of his discussion, he clearly is alluding to something that he saw in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. The same thing is true in the other lands that I was in. Now, I don't know what other lands he was in. He talked about him being in Spain. What were the other lands that he was in? And I will tell you what I believe. Spain at this point wasn't one country, nor was France. Right? When he talked about Spain, although usually they refer to Spain Sfarad as a geographic area, not a political area, Surfas also means a geographic area, not a political area. Okay, but I have a suspicion when he means Shar Aratzos, he means that he went through several different countries, which he definitely would have gone through, places that are under various different kings, dukes, counts, whatever else you have. Spain at this point, 13th century, was probably divided at least 6 to 8 different monarchies, some Christian, some Muslim. And the France was Christian at the time, right? But the kings of France had almost no control over the southern parts of France. They only had control over the very northern parts, maybe Paris and the Ile-de-France, which called the Ile-de-France area is not far from this, really incorporates what Cousy is. But they had no control over, let's say, the southern parts of France, like what we refer to as the Provence, with no control of anything over there. I'm assuming that that's what he means by it, but I don't know, right? Okay. Viskablu divrei dvorai b'chol hamakomos. I was accepted in all these places. Bikshu mimeni lichtov perish hamitzvahs b'koitzer. They asked me to write a commentary on the mitzvahs in brief. Okay. V'hineni shoel ezer meis elokei golius Yisrael l'chepza b'yodi yatzliach. So apparently this was something that he wrote as he's beginning his work. It's the third mitzvah that he's writing on. And although he wrote a brief introduction of this mitzvah, of the mitzvah saseh part, his main introduction he writes at the lo sasehs, which he wrote later. So it seems like for some reason he wrote the Sefer HaMitzvahs on the mitzvah sasehs first. We know that. And he wrote a very brief introduction. This was kind of like part of what he meant as an introduction. Somehow in the middle of writing it, he decided to talk about this. So, okay, that's one thing. Now, I want to talk about a couple of other mitzvahs that he mentions. Mitzvah 17, mitzvah say number 17. To the best of my knowledge, he is the only one of the certainly only one of the major counters of mitzvahs to count this as a separate mitzvah. Okay? Mitzvah say l'tzadek es hadin. Okay, now, he has here an explanation, okay, and it's a beautiful explanation, okay. It's a mitzvah say that no matter what happens in life that doesn't go your way, to accept it as this is what Hashem is doing. He ka'asher yaser ish es b'no kein Hashem lekecha miyasreka. As Hashem, right, admonishes, as a man admonishes his child, little kid, let's say, not appreciative of what dad is doing to him or the pot he's got right now or whatever else punishment he's gotten, whether it's taking away his, whatever he's supposed to get money for this week, his, et cetera, whatever it might be. Okay. The Rashi Ha'aseh Hazel Rabbi. I taught this in public. Why? Because apparently this was one of his trips. He got to the same place twice. And one man told him, you came the first time, and I did tshuva, complete tshuva on it. Right? But since I did tshuva, everything's gone bad. Everybody thinks, well, we did tshuva, everything's going to be good. Right? What happened? Now that I did tshuva, things are going bad for me? Why should they go bad for me? So he tells him, 1 second. What happens if a person is a Russia, a real Russia, right? A Jew who is a Jewish Russia who never did a mitzvah? There's no such thing as a Jew who never did a mitzvah. I mean, Meyer Lansky, who was certainly no great tzaddik, he was a murderer, first class. He was a gangster, okay? Complete gangster, okay? To say that he had no merits, not true. I can tell you things about him. I don't have time today to go through it. Remember, I'll have to remind me some other time, but I can tell you the things that Meyer Lansky did that definitely qualify as tzidkus, okay? Not that I've never read or written a biography of Meyer Lansky, but I do know things that he did that he would definitely call tzidkus, okay? Doesn't mean that he wasn't firstly capable of rubbing out people that he didn't do it go his way. Even, he was a murderer, straightforward murderer. And other people do the murdering for him, but he's the one who did the orders. Okay? Meyer Lansky, right? Well, his mitzvahs, where did he get rewarded? In this world. But he's going to go to Olam Haba? What does Olam Haba speak to him about? If Olam Haba is a world of spirituality, what does a gangster have anything to gain from spirituality? Right? So it happens to have been Meyer Lansky was never convicted. Okay, let me correct that. He never served time, okay, for his crimes. He was convicted and on appeal, okay, it never got past appeal. He died in his own bed, okay, while his convictions were on appeal. Okay. Now that's a schus of something, right? And they're speaking. Now I'm not saying. So the Smag turns to this fellow and he told him, when you were, by your own admission, a Russia, and you had done mitzvahs for sure, where were you going to get the reward for those mitzvahs? in this world. Right? Now you became a big tzaddik. That's good. That's very nice. Wonderful. Big thing, right? Okay. Now, we know that if somebody does pure tshuva, then they won't take any avera of theirs with them into the next world. Okay? But there are averas that one does that have to get punished. Tshuva, full tshuva, will do tshuva on mitzvah say. It's as low, you can get full tshuva, wipes it off the charts completely. But there's a whole slew of averas that a person can do, right, for which tshuva all on its own doesn't mechaper. Okay, Chil Hashem is one. Okay, doesn't fully mechaper. What does he need for that? Okay, he needs some type of yisurim, misa. There's things that need to be done in this world. He won't take any averas with him into the next world. When you were not qualified to get into Olam Haba, right, then all the mitzvahs that you did had to get rewarded in this world. Right? Now that you become a tzaddik, what? Hashem's going to give you rewards in this world for that? That's not fair to you. You should get the rewards in the next world, where they really count, where they're really important. Whatever, what's going on, right? You need the rewards where they really count, right? That you have to understand. Now, what was the Smag's chiddush here? Nobody else agrees with this? Of course everybody agrees with this hashkaf. Hashkaf is 100% true. Everyone agrees with this hashkaf. What was the Smag's difference? He counted it as one of the 613 mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah, v'yodata im levavecha ki kasher yiyaser ish es beno kein Hashem elokecha miyasreka, right? And he tells you he was derish in public about this, and he explained all the concepts of this, right, as a mitzvah on its own. Okay? Tell you one more that he has, okay? That's another mitzvah that V'rom levavecha v'shachachta es Hashem elokecha. You become haughty and you forget Hashem, your God. Tzemach counts that as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Becoming haughty, becoming a Baal Gaiva, okay, in and of itself is a violation of one of the 613 mitzvahs. Okay? He has a few others that he counts that we don't have. Share with you. If you look at the Smag's mitzvahs and you look at the Rambam's count of mitzvahs, they're not organized the same way. These organizations very different, but the concepts, right, and the numbering, the count, he counts almost all the same mitzvahs. However, right here and there, he has different trees that he counts, and he was the first one that I know of to combine the Ashkenazic and Sephardic Masorah in halacha from the earlier Bali Tosfos. The first one to count in the Sefer mitzvahs like the Rambam's basic approach, but being novel, right, and original in going through them and not accepting exactly line for line what the Rambam said. Okay, and at the same time, he wrote a halachic work which became barely accepted among the Ashkenazi Jews. Now, folks, who counted the 613 mitzvahs in Cousy? The Count of Cousy. Have a good one, everybody. See y'all next week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
And try to keep cool.